I'm excited to be with you in my former home state. I was born in San Jose and moved to San Diego. I grew up there as a kid, and now I live in Utah. I was told that the theme of your conference, maybe you know, maybe you don't know, but the powers that be told me that the theme of your conference is disruption. So I thought to myself, what could I say to a bunch of fellow libertarians about disruption? What's a unique message? What's one that we don't often hear? I could come up here and talk about all the typical things that you guys are already well versed in, but what's something that would be more insightful for you to come away from today with? And what came to mind is a quote from Michael Novak. Michael Novak was kind of a political commentator, wrote a bunch of books years ago, and he has this quote that years ago stuck with me very deeply, and I think relates exactly to the theme of disruption. So the quote says, "Between the omnipotent state and the naked individual looms the first line of resistance against totalitarianism, the economically and politically independent family, protecting the space within which free and independent individuals may receive the necessary years of nurture." I find that quote so interesting because I think as libertarians, we're very individualistic. We're rugged individualists, and we don't often talk about the importance of the family in achieving our goals. We don't often consider how disruptive the state can be and historically has been when it comes to our families. That indeed the biggest threat to individual liberty is the undermining of the natural family. And the greatest way to promote our ideas is by using that same institution. I'll give you one quick example. If you take the average person on the side of the road, you stop them and you say, "Hey, I've got this great book." I mean, it could be Atlas Shrugged, it can be The Road to Serfdom, it can be Economics in One Lesson, pick your book. You stop that guy on the street and say, "Hey, I want you to read this." What percentage of people do you think would take you up on the offer? Anyone want to say over 5% of people? Under 1%, probably most likely. If you take that same person, imagine he's got 3 kids at home, and you say, "Do you think it's important for your kids to be well-rounded? For your kids to learn about entrepreneurship or the way the world works, to be critical thinkers?" "Oh yeah, absolutely." Would you like some help in doing that, to talk to your kids about these ideas?" "Oh yeah, absolutely." So we hand them a Tuttle Twins book. And suddenly the barriers have come down, and that same individual who resisted the education when it was in a non-fiction 300-page form without any pictures and illustrations to make it easier, is now receiving the same ideas under the guise of teaching their own kids. So when we talk to families instead of adults, our message goes further faster. And this is something that we've seen borne out. So Novak's quote, he talks about the contrast between the omnipotent state and the naked individual. I want to break this down a little bit because I think this is highly relevant to what we're dealing with today. So the omnipotent state, I don't think any of us in this room really need to question whether the state is omnipotent or not. When I was doing research a few years ago for one of the books I was writing, I came across a term that I had never before heard of. We know what suicide is. It's if you kill yourself. We know what homicide is. It's if you kill another person. We know what genocide is, if you kill a whole ethnic group of people. What do you call it when a government kills its own people? Anyone know the name of that term? Yes, sir. Democide. Okay, we have a winner. This guy knew it too, right? Democide. That was a new term to me. And so when I was looking into this idea of the state's omnipotence, I came across democide and the alarming statistic that in the 20th century alone, governments killed more than 262 million of their own people. Talk about an omnipotent state. Talk about one that can disrupt the family by killing the parents, orphaning the children, or killing the entire family. 262 million, that's more than all of the combined soldiers that died and all of the individuals that died from so-called collateral damage in all the wars of the 20th century. The state is supremely omnipotent. We see this we work sometimes with like CPS and parental rights. our think tank Libertas, we passed a bunch of laws, and we led Utah to be the first state to pass the so-called free-range parenting law. You guys heard of this? Lenore Skenazy, I think most people know about her work. And so we worked with Lenore years ago and passed a law saying, like, you know that thing that we used to call parenting a few decades ago? Now it's called free-range parenting. Can we legalize that and not punish moms for letting their kids walk to the grocery store? So we got a law change designed to limit the power of CPS to go, and law enforcement to go punish these parents. But in that area of law, there's this doctrine called parens patriae. It's Latin. It stands for father of the nation. It basically means that the state sees itself as the backstop parent. And we can perhaps understand this in some cases where there are absolutely parents that are abusive and neglectful, and those children deserve to be protected. So one can concede that there is room for some type of intervention. But that doctrine has allowed the state to insert itself far beyond just protecting kids from abuse and neglect. It's led to compulsory education laws, which I like to call compulsory schooling laws, because schooling does not necessarily imply education, right? Where the state forces you to go to its schools. Did you know that it wasn't until the 80s that homeschool was legalized? That in the so-called land of the free, homeschool was against the law for a very long time because of these compulsory schooling laws? And it was only because of the court, the litigation efforts by HSLDA, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and others in the 80s that they started to kind of undermine that and allow homeschooling to be more free. I remember years ago, 5-6 years ago, in the UK, there was the story of Alfie Evans. I don't know if you guys remember this. It was all over the news. This international scandal. This tiny infant, Alfie, had massive brain damage, and the doctors in the hospital alleged and believed that Alfie would not survive. They wanted to take Alfie off of life support. His parents disagreed, wanted a second opinion, wanted to transfer Alfie to another hospital and then to another country, where countries were stepping in and saying, we will take Alfie, we will care for Alfie, we will care for this family. And the court intervened and prohibited the transfer of Alfie to any other hospital or country. They were forcing Alfie to die in their care, in their supposed care. And the parents were, as you might imagine, fighting tooth and nail against that system. It was appealed all the way to the highest court, where they completely rejected the idea. They said that it's not in the child's best interests to be transferred. And so the state is the arbiter in these cases of what is in a child's best interest. This is the same with compulsory schooling. So from a family context, the state is omnipotent, whether we're talking about war or schooling or anything in between. I think we all understand that in this room. Okay, so then going back to Novak's quote where he says, between the omnipotent state and the naked individual, what does it mean for an individual to be naked? This being a libertarian conference, I have to be very careful about what direction this conversation goes, because it can get really silly really fast. But I'm reminded, naked, obviously, we're talking in the abstract. There's 4 criteria that I want to go into. We can be naked physically, we can be naked socially, we can be naked spiritually and intellectually. And I'm reminded of this quote that I came across from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He says, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Can you relate to that? Do you think in our society we can relate to that? It reminds me of Isaiah 3, and the people shall be oppressed, everyone by another, and everyone by his neighbor. The state is not some abstract fiction. The state is our neighbors trying to use coercion against us to further their own ends. That's who we're fighting. That's what the resistance is against that Novak was talking about. So naked individuals, there's this inverse correlation between the size of the state, I'll say the strength of the state and the strength of our families. As the state, as our families and as ourselves as individuals, as we are strong, the state is weak, right? If we're taking care of our families, taking care of one another in the community, if we're providing for one another and doing what we ought as social humans, the state has far less relevance in our lives. The greatest way then to fight the state is not by passing laws or filing lawsuits, but by strengthening society, to take away the purported means for which so many people turn to the state for help. So it goes by contrast that as individuals become weak and as families become weak, the state grows because people need help and they turn to someone for help. It leads to this quote from Alexis de Tocqueville that, man, this is spot on. Here's what he says. Above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power, which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood. But it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. For their happiness, such a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent and the only arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasures, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, regulates the descent of poverty, and subdivides their inheritances. What remains but to spare them all the care of thinking and all the trouble of living? That's nakedness. The state wants us to be naked. The state wants us to be weak. The state wants us to depend on it because that is its strength. That is its blood. So physical nakedness, let's start there. I got my start in politics in 2008. I'd been married for a year. I was watching TV, and I saw news of this raid by the feds in Texas of a compound or ranch or whatever called Yearning for Zion. This ranch was owned by the fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a bunch of polygamists, this offshoot branch that has become, in past decades, very reclusive. And you remember Warren Jeffs, the name Warren Jeffs, you may remember the news. Sleazy dude, having sex with underage girls, just creepy, culty, awful. So the guy was up to no good, for sure. But what troubled me watching the news unfold, of course, later we found out that they invaded this property on a false tip. There was this woman that called the hotline and claimed to be a girl inside the compound who was being abused. So hundreds of officers and guns and tanks and everything swoop in. Turns out that that was a crank call, that it wasn't actually anyone actually suffering. And we might say, well, Warren Jeffs was a bad guy. He had to be, dealt with. He was a scumbag. He was, and he did need to be dealt with. But what troubled me watching the news unfold was that they took over 400 children from their parents. They removed them from the people who loved them the most, and they placed them in the Texas foster care system, which at the time, and probably still, had a horrible track record for physical, sexual abuse, drug abuse. There were kids getting pregnant from their foster caretakers. Bad, bad system. And Texas isn't alone in that type of tragedy in the foster care system. I was incensed seeing all of these kids just taken away, that the state had the power to intervene and break up these families. So, I had no idea what I was doing. I was a web developer. I built websites for a living. I started an online petition. A bunch of people ended up signing it. I got on the news. That was my first TV interview. Felt kind of awkward. Here I am, defending these polygamists and people that I don't really have any relationship with. But no one was standing up and speaking up for their rights. And they saw very concretely their physical nakedness, especially those kids. They couldn't defend themselves. They couldn't stop what was happening. They were at the mercy of an omnipotent state. And so that, to me, was the first eye-opening encounter of how weak we are, how physically naked we are. Certainly, we are socially naked as well. We libertarians, we like to think that we're very intellectual, we're very logical, we're logical thinkers, the lot of us. The challenge we have is that humans are not logical. We don't persuade people to believe in our ideas through logic. I remember spending my first few years as an online warrior for truth on social media as Ron Paul revolution and everyone else is wrong and we got to convince everyone of the truth of our ways. And I would engage in these online debates and piss off a bunch of people and convert no one. Because people ultimately are not logical. They are psychological. They're social. They're emotional. And so we as individuals, we're socially naked because as when we're born, we find ourselves in this social network of the family that gives us definition. It gives us identity. We draw our identity and our support from these social institutions, right? Man was not made to live alone. We can't. There have been whole TV shows about people trying and failing. We're social creatures. We crave identity. So the question for us is, where do we derive our identity from? Do we derive it from, if you're religious, from your church community and God? Do you derive it from family? Do you derive it from your community, your favorite sports team, your hometown, whatever? Too many people derive their identity from the state, and we become equally tribalistic as the state grows. So we're socially naked. Relatedly, we're spiritually naked. We yearn as humans, so many of us, for answers to the big questions of life, to what that identity is. We, throughout history, have engaged in rituals and practices and traditions and teachings that help us on that path or that journey to try and understand what is true. Well, the state offers its own counterfeit for religion. I mean, some of the most anti-religious people I know are the most religious. It's just that their God is not Christ, it's Caesar, right? And they have their traditions and their rites and their rituals and their robes of their priesthood, and they'll condemn all the, disbelievers and everyone else, and they're very religious about their activities. It's just a different religion. Rudy Giuliani once said, because we are like a religion, really, a secular religion. The state itself, it has its temples, it has its rituals, its monuments, its sacraments. I mean, for me, one of the big eye-openers when I was kind of red-pilling myself years ago was learning about the Pledge of Allegiance. Anyone know the name of the guy who wrote the Pledge of Allegiance? Pop quiz? Bellamy, Francis Bellamy. Tootsie Roll for the winner down there. Francis Bellamy, he was a socialist. He did not want kids to learn about liberty or learn about the principles of the Republic from the founding fathers. This was a secular humanist socialist. He saw government as God. He wanted to subordinate children to the state. He wanted them to become collectivists, not individualists. And this guy was the person who created the Pledge of Allegiance. So when I learned this years ago, I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to participate in that. And I realized that I had been doing it for years. Almost like, kids who are taken to Sunday school but never really do the thinking for themselves as they mature about what do I really believe and do I believe this? Do I believe something else? I had not really challenged those things that I was led to experience as a child, and I realized that it was very religious-like with these types of rituals and these sacraments that we go through. So we're spiritually naked as well. Finally, we are intellectually naked. There's this great quote from Hannah Arendt, who wrote, she's written a lot about totalitarianism, fantastic books. She said, the ideal subject for those who wish to rule is people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists. So then you think about the society in which we live right now and the war on truth, as I like to call it, and the fake news and the so-called disinformation, and now we're going to be getting into AI and deep fakes and all the rest, and how are we going to tell what is true from what is false? Alan Dulles was the first director of the CIA. He gave this speech decades ago, July 1953, stands up in front of all these people, and he's decrying what the Soviets were doing. He said that they were brainwashing. Here's his quote. He says, the aim of the Soviet program is to condition the mind so that it no longer reacts on a free will or rational basis, but responds to impulses implanted from outside. If we are to counter this kind of warfare, we must understand the techniques the Soviets are trying to adopt to control men's minds. The human mind is the most delicate of all instruments. It's so finely adjusted, so susceptible to the impact of outside influences, that it is proving a malleable tool in the hands of sinister men. We in the West are somewhat handicapped in brain warfare. It is hard for us to realize that in the great area behind the Iron Curtain, a vast experiment is underway to change men's minds, working on them continuously from youth to old age. Yet what Dulles, however you say his name, did not reveal to the crowd that he was speaking with, where he was pontificating about how horrible the Soviets were for doing this, is that he was overseeing a program called Project MKUltra that was doing the very thing that he was decrying the socialists for doing. experimenting on unwitting participants with electroshock therapy, hypnosis, drugs, and the rest. It was the Inspector General, purportedly the person in government who is intended to oversee such programs and make sure that people's rights are being protected and that the government isn't running afoul of any laws. It was the Inspector General who wrote this: "Precautions must be taken not only to protect operations from exposure to enemy forces, but also to conceal these activities from the American public in general. The knowledge that the agency, the CIA, is engaging in unethical and illicit activities would have serious repercussions in political and diplomatic circles and would be detrimental to the accomplishment of its mission." So much for being an Inspector General. I'm reminded of a situation in which there were these crazy people who came up with this plan designed to pull America into war with the Soviets. This was during kind of the Cuban Missile Crisis and all of those events. And these crackpots came up with this plan that they were promoting, designed to shoot down people traveling in makeshift boats and rafts from Cuba, blame it on the Cubans. They wanted to bomb cities in Florida and blame it on the Cubans. They wanted to kill Cuban Americans and blame it on the Cubans. And this was the crazy idea that they came up with. It didn't happen, much to their chagrin, which is interesting because these crackpots I'm referring to were the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the US military, the top brass, the people in charge who've sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution and protect Americans, were literally proposing killing Americans, falsely blaming it on Cuba so that they could induce Americans, deceive them into supporting war and intervention, which is what they wanted. And the whole reason it didn't happen is because the president, JFK, shot it down. We're intellectually naked. We didn't know that that happened for years. Imagine if it happened. Imagine if they carried out their plan. The narrative would have been for decades, and perhaps still today, that it was Cubans who did it. And our history books would repeat that fact, and kids would grow up believing that fact. We are intellectually naked to the extent that we don't know what truth actually is. Is it any wonder that Novak pits the omnipotent state against the naked individual, because by contrast, we are weak? Okay, so then he says, between the omnipotent state and the naked individual looms the first line of resistance against totalitarianism, the economically and politically independent family. There was a story a few years ago. So what does it mean to be an independent family? The Wunderlichs lived in Germany, probably still do, I think. They were homeschooling their kids. And one day, 33 armed officers showed up at their house, used a battering ram, broke down the front door, and pulled the kids out and took them away. Their charge was not abuse or neglect, although I suppose it kind of was. It was educational abuse, educational neglect, simply for homeschooling their children. This was all done at the behest of an official in the government who said, and I quote, "I am certainly of the opinion that there is a danger to the children, because they are systemically withdrawn from all social aspects of society and live in a so-called parallel society." The Wunderlichs appealed through all the courts. They got up to the European Court of Human Rights, which ruled that the family had not, quote, "provided sufficient evidence that the children were properly educated and socialized." So that court upheld Germany's prohibition on homeschooling, a law, by the way, that had been on the books since 1938 when the Nazis signed it into law. So this is why families need to be independent, is precisely for these situations. Do you remember during so we'll talk economic independence, political independence. So starting with the economic independence, do you recall when Obama was first running for president? His team put together this project called Life of Julia. Does anyone remember this? A few people. It was this whole weird thing showing this fictional girl named Julia from cradle to grave, and how at every step along her journey of life, Julia was cared for by the government, that the state was there for her. look, when she was a baby, she had, neonatal care and all this insurance designed to, help maternal care and everything. And then there was state-funded preschool and then school and, Pell Grants for college and state-subsidized health insurance and all the rest. They literally listed, and they had these series of graphics where you would see Julia get older. And I was disgusted by that, right? Those of you who remember, I'm sure were as well. Like here on display was this praising of dependence. The state today subsidizes nearly half of the population. Half of Americans live at the mercy of the state. How in the world are we going to have freedom in a society where there is such little economic independence? Think of the founding fathers. Could you imagine if the people who ended up being there during the Constitutional Convention or the earlier conventions that produced the Articles, and we could have a fun discussion about whether the Articles of Confederation is better than the Constitution. That would be a fun topic. But could you imagine if the delegates who were sent there were not economically independent? If they didn't have the means to leave their farms or their industries or their companies for weeks, months at a time. If they were living hand to mouth and had to go work their 9 to 5, work the farm, who would have been there in their place? And so the question to us today is, if we're not economically independent, can we work on higher order activities? Can we be engaged in this cause to the degree that we need to be? Economic independence is a prerequisite for us if we want to fight for freedom. And then political independence. I mean, society is going to be arranged in some form or fashion. It's up to us to try and decide what form that will take. Alexis de Tocqueville talked about, remember he came to America and he toured what then was America, and he ended up writing a couple volumes of this book kind of chronicling his journey. And he talked about what he called mediating institutions. He was shocked that how when there were needs in America, when someone was in need of, particular resources or a opportunity, or there was, starving people or immigration or whatever the issue was, he was blown away because in Europe, he said, whenever there is a need, whenever someone raises their hand in need, it's the state that shows up. There's some minister, there's some politician who steps forward and says, I'll take care of you. And that's the life that he was accustomed to. By contrast, he was blown away at how when he came to America, he said, for every need that arises, there is an association created. A mediating institution, a civic group, people coming together to help those in need. There's a fantastic book, I think the title is called From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State, and it chronicles how in America's early years, for decades, you'd have these mutual aid societies for health insurance, for life insurance, for childcare, for elderly care. These were people who would band together and help one another, and it was all done voluntarily. It would be the Irish helping the Irish, or the Chinese helping the Chinese, or the Christians helping the Christians, and you would have this social fabric of institutions. You didn't have all these people dying on the streets. All the welfare state proponents today like to think that before the welfare state, there were just people dying left and right, and thank God for government to step in and save the day. That wasn't the case at all. But increasingly, the state started to crowd out these mutual aid societies through the imposition of taxes. Because why would people join an association and pay dues and show up to meetings and have to go to conventions and participate in these processes if they could just pay their taxes and be done with it? Oh, I'm charitable. The state will take care of them. And so incrementally, over the course of about 2 decades, these mutual aid societies went bankrupt. They lost their membership because they couldn't compete with the state. That is why independence is needed, because the state is going to do the exact same thing to us. Okay, so Novak talks about how the economically and independent families need to give necessary years of nurture. Writing the Tuttle Twins books, it's been interesting over the years to get accused of indoctrination, right? That we're indoctrinating kids. And at first, I kind of resisted that criticism. I pushed back against it. I said, we're not doing that, Indoctrination is what the crazy authoritarians do. It's what the government schools do. A few years ago, I realized that was a losing battle, and frankly, wrong. We are indoctrinating kids. It's just that everybody indoctrinates. I mean, what is indoctrination? It's just teaching doctrine. Our children are going to be exposed to all kinds of ideas. The question is, whose ideas and by whom are they exposed? Everyone indoctrinates. So now we lean into it and we say we're indoctrinating kids too. That is the necessary years of nurture, because our ideological opponents are doing the same thing. Like when I talk to parents, I say, you don't understand. If you don't realize that your children's minds are ground zero in an intellectual battlefield, then they've already become a casualty. If you, like, what parent would send their children to war, in some faraway land without body armor and a weapon and training on who the enemy is, when they're supposed to shoot, in what direction, what are the rules of engagement? Could you imagine an 18-year-old kid showing up to, let's just say, the Middle East, because that's where all the modern foreign interventions are being done. So they show up in, let's say, Libya, and they have no uniform, they have no shield, they have no protection, they have no weapon. Let's say they have a weapon for fun. They have a weapon, but they have no clue who the enemy is. They don't know what he looks like. They don't know how he operates. They don't know where he lives. Like, what's the point? And yet we do that every day with our children. We do not equip them intellectually, philosophically, to understand what their armor is, what they need to be doing, what weaponry they can use, who the enemy is, who the opponents are. If we don't help our kids understand that we're in a mind war, then we're already losing. That is why I think the necessary years of nurture are so important. It's like when I started a garden a few years ago with my family, and my kids were very young at the time. And I remember spending all this money buying those little, what do they call them, saplings or whatever, the little starters that you get at Home Depot or whatever, because I didn't want to do the seeds and take forever. That would take way too long. I'm too impatient for that. So I bought all the little starters. We plant them all. We were out there for hours, and I felt like, yeah, I'm a homesteader now. I got my chickens. I got my bees. I got a garden. I can go off grid, except for plumbing. I want to keep my plumbing. So I plant all these plants in the ground, and I'm proud of myself. And the next day, we live in a very windy area. A big windstorm came, and I realized I had not done anything to shield these little plants from the winds that came. I had invested all this time, all this energy, all this money, and I went out there and I lost 2/3 of them within 24 hours, just because they got whipped around and they had no protection of any kind. Then the ones that survived had bug infestations and all the pests that came in, and the only thing we ended up growing that year was zucchini, which is like a weed. I mean, zucchini can grow in like a crack in your driveway. That stuff will grow. We had zucchini bread and zucchini everything for months because there was a ton of zucchini, but nothing else survived. And I didn't realize how hard it would be to shield my little plants from the oppositional forces that came in upon them. That's the message. That's the observation I made, that if we're not intentional, we're going to lose our kids. There's a great quote from an evangelical pastor. I can't remember his name, but I'll pull this over to the political application. In his religious context, he says that, can we as Christians really be surprised when we send our kids to Caesar's schools and they return home as Romans? Can we as liberty lovers really be surprised when our kids are, during their most intellectually formative years, learning from and wanting to be like all the crap we see in TikTok and social media and in the schools today? Can we really be so shocked when they come home and say, I love Bernie Sanders? Like, are we going to be that surprised? We shouldn't be. I'll end with this story as to why. During the Hungarian Revolution, very brief revolution, they were being occupied by the Soviets. There were soldiers and tanks scattered throughout Hungary. And in Buda and Pest, different sides of, I think it's a river, maybe it's a creek. But in Budapest, there were these people who rose up and threw off the Soviets, largely teenagers. They started making little Molotov cocktails and they started destroying these tanks. The Soviets felt like the Hungarians weren't that big of a threat, so they had their newer soldiers there and their crappier tanks there, but they had a presence. That presence was opposed and thrown off in the course of a few days by this revolt largely led by teenagers. They had independence for at least a few days before the Soviets returned. They started forming their own government. They started organizing. They started a radio station. They were trying to kind of build up these institutions and make sure that they could protect their newfound freedom after repelling the Soviets. The Soviets came back. They came back with way more soldiers, way more tanks, bigger, better tanks, and they crushed the revolt. Consequently, thousands of families streamed out of Hungary, where they were hopeful for at least a few days. They started fleeing their country. There was one family, the Hadjocks, and they had a girl named Vera. I think she was 11 years old, and then they had a boy. And they go over across the bridge at Andau into Austria, and there were some journalists there interviewing all these people coming across the border. Tell us your story. Tell us what happened. And little 11-year-old Vera starts speaking up and saying, our teachers were telling us lies. Everyone was telling us lies. We didn't believe them at all. And so naturally, the interviewers are very intrigued by this young girl who's speaking very forcefully and very plainly. So they start talking to her and learning from her about why she believed the way she did. They turned to the mom and they said, how is it that your 11-year-old daughter knows such things and has these opinions? So Mrs. Hadjock replied and she said, every night after the kids were done with school and the lights were off and the power went out, we would sit in the cellar as a family and we would read, they were Catholic, we would read the Bible, she said, and we would teach our children morality and truth. And we would wash away from their brains all the evil things they had learned that day. She was asked then if other families had done that. Were other families doing what the Hadjocks did? Mrs. Hadjock said, I have no idea, because we were so fearful to talk to anyone about what we were doing that we didn't tell anyone. We didn't even want to do this with our kids for a while, she said, because if they were too young, they might blurt out to a teacher what we had told them at home, and then suddenly we go off to the gulag. So you have to wait for that age at which the children are old enough to keep a secret from those in power, but young enough that it's early enough for you to go counteract all the crap that they're getting from the government. It's that same level of intentionality I feel that we as lovers of liberty need with our families. We need to wash away the evil things that our kids are getting exposed to. We have to recognize that their minds are ground zero for an intellectual battlefield. We need to recognize that the greatest way that we can spread our ideas is supporting moms and dads in teaching their kids. I, for years, have worked through Libertas, and before that, a variety of other groups and parties and all kinds of stuff trying to promote the ideas of liberty. I have found nothing nearly as successful as simply helping moms and dads help their kids. For too long, we wait until people are adults before we share the ideas of freedom with them, when they're voters, when they're adults. And that's important. We need to do it. But there's power in teaching kids. There's power in supporting families, because that is the social fabric we need to strengthen if we want to shrink the state. Thank you, everybody.